Welcome to the first podcast series here at the Coping Mechanism. In this series, we explore the findings of our first survey, which looks at how we're coping through the COVID-19 pandemic. In each episode, we are joined by experts who give us a deeper understanding into these findings, as well as an evaluation of what we might expect in the near future. I'm Malika Speaks, poet and spoken word artist, and I've been hosting these conversations. I will also give you my thoughts and conclusions at the end of the video. In this episode, we look at how groups of people from different financial securities compare and what they may need psychosocially and with material change as a result of the pandemic. The survey showed us that those from the financially stable group struggled with boredom and the inability to socialise and take part in leisure activities as they could before the pandemic. Alongside this, we have those from the financially less stable group who expressed their struggles as concerns around job security and being able to feed their family. We are joined by Jess from the Living Wage Foundation and James from Phoenix Futures, who give us a deeper understanding into these findings and how we as communities can support these groups of people. Welcome to another podcast with the Coping Mechanism. Today's podcast is going to be looking at financial inequality and well-being. Today we are joined by Jess from the Living Wage Foundation and James, who is from Phoenix Futures, and of course, as ever, Anita Nair, social psychologist and director here at the Coping Mechanism. Anita, would you be able to start us off with why we are looking at this today?
Yeah, this was a really interesting part of the survey. So we looked at how people are coping according to their level of financial security. So we have one group which we termed the financially insecure. Those were people who had no savings. They were mostly, many of them were in the unemployed bracket, around 20-25% were in the unemployed bracket. And then many others were working from home or on furlough, but it definitely had a much higher percentage in the unemployed bracket than the people we termed the financially secure. The financially secure are people who are most likely, by far, about almost 50% were working from home. And they had 6 months or more savings, and sometimes had investments too. So these are people who had that kind of safety blanket. So what we were really looking for in the difference was, in this time of financial uncertainty, how are people coping if they have that safety net of finance, and how are people coping who don't. And we found some quite significant differences. What we found with the more financially insecure group was that they were much more likely to agree, significantly more likely to agree, that the pandemic has made existing problems more obvious to them. They were also significantly more likely to agree with the statement that they have struggled through the pandemic. And they had a lower agreement, although it wasn't statistically significant. They had lower agreement with the statement that I have found ways to manage through the pandemic. So it sort of paints a picture already that we're really struggling here. This is hard. Compare that to the financially secure group with that safety blanket. They are statistically significantly more likely to disagree or strongly disagree with the statement that I have struggled a lot through the pandemic. So the inverse. They are, again, significantly more likely to strongly agree that they have found ways to manage through the pandemic. So they're really, they're managing, they don't feel that they're struggling so much. And we're also looking at this word cloud. We asked them, which 3 emotions have you felt most strongly since the coronavirus started? The first emotion for the financially insecure group really contained things like anxiety, worry, fear, sadness. So quite traumatic words, the sort of words of distress. Now, those words of distress did also occur frequently with the financially secure group, but we also saw a lot of boredom as the first emotion that comes to mind. So we call that, there's a boredom privilege there. And it also tells us, from a psychological perspective, just that difference between the experience of trauma, much more heightened in the financially insecure group. And we can see why, right? Because we're already seeing that they're struggling more, and that issues that have affected them in the past are becoming more obvious to them. In the qualitative questions, we got a bit more of a flavour of that. So it was, our struggles are things like, for the financially insecure, paying the next bill, paying my rent, knowing if I'll have a job. although those things did occur for the financially secure group because all jobs are at risk, it was less pronounced. Finally, another interesting thing that we saw between the coping in the financially insecure versus coping with the financially secure was the sense of safety and what that did for how we behave towards others in terms of that sense of control that we have over the situation, over others around us. So whilst everybody had low trust in government, the financially insecure group was significantly more likely to not have trust in their workplace, and that didn't occur so much in the financially secure group, and that's really interesting because that sat alongside another question about how well people around you keep to the rules, and do you have anything to say about how people around you are keeping to the rules? Now, the financially insecure group were more likely to make statements that were about trying to control the behaviour of people around them. So, for example, where everybody universally felt that people were breaking the rules, we found with the financially insecure, they kind of went the step further and said, I've wanted to ask the shop to repaint the footsteps outside because people aren't keeping 2 meters apart, or I wanted to tell somebody to stay back, or I wanted people to be reminded. There was this real need of people to be reminded and controlled. The government needs to tell them, people need to make this really obvious what the rules are. So there's that kind of heightened sense of a need to control the situation because it's really impacting me, and so it sort of feeds that, you know, that feeling of kind of higher distress, higher trauma around this. So we see this kind of quite distinct picture between the two groups, and I think the big question for us is, financial inequality is not something that's about to get better, as our guests will speak to. This is, you know, there is a cause for the emotional distress in this group, and that cause is going to continue and probably get worse. So how do we, as practitioners, as organisations and organisers, how do we support people for whom the cause of their distress is not going away anytime soon? And I'm really happy to have the two guests we've got, because I think they can speak to this marvellously. So I'm really excited to hear from you both.
Thank you, Anita. I think the first question I'd like to ask both James and Jess is, who will continue to be most affected by financial insecurity in the following months, and how?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about some of the research that we'd also done really just before the pandemic hit around the numbers of people who were in insecure and low paid work. So we did some research with NEF, the Neuroeconomics Foundation, to find out how many workers were in that kind of low paid, i.e. less than the living wage, and insecure, meaning they didn't have enough hours to make ends meet, work. And there were over 5 million workers who were affected. 2 million of those were parents, and a quarter of them were classed as key workers. And there's also a huge amount of crossover with the industries that are affected, so retail, wholesale, and health and social care. There's a huge overlap with those industries that are still on furlough now or are just starting to return to work. And like James was saying, it's also kind of, it mirrored the kind of groups that were also generally worse affected by coronavirus. So 18% of workers were from BAME backgrounds who were in this insecure low paid work. That was in comparison to 50% of people from white backgrounds. It affected more women than men. So I guess the issue that we've got now is that not only is it that there are already 5 million people in low paid work, but we've also got an increase in unemployment. I think it's up by up to 9%, which is higher than it's forecasted to be higher than it was at the height of the previous financial crisis. And the job adverts are down 50% in comparison to this time last year. And we're likely to see the kind of that sort of mismatching of the where we need to be and kind of the increasingly bad situation for people looking for work. I think it just becomes really clear. And in terms of the kind of material impact on people, we did a piece of research a couple of years ago. It's called the Life on Low Pay reports. And and we surveyed 1,000 parents who are paid less than the living wage. And 71% of those parents worried so much about being in poverty that it affected their day-to-day life. 35% of them felt always or often very lonely, and 48% said that the stress of life on low pay actually affected their life at work as well, and their performance at work. So it does have a real, so there's those kind of statistics. You can start to see the real impact on people, especially that's exacerbated by the fact that they are feeling, like you said, Anita, with all the research that is sort of exacerbating previous problems and making things really impactful on a very material level for people.
How can organisations supporting people through this pandemic identify some of these vulnerabilities in the financially insecure people? And more importantly, I think, how can they best support those people?
I think it comes back to the sort of fundamental of what makes good health, really, which I think is fundamentally communication, really. So keep talking. So as the organisations that are supporting people in their local communities get together and think, what can we do? What can we do differently? Bringing ideas together from across the organisation, engaging the local community in those ideas that they, the people that they support. And encouraging people in a safe and appropriate way to talk about the harms that they're experiencing, the fears that we talked about fear there, the very real fear of what might happen in the future, talking about lack of control. And often there will be people out there working for community groups that are supporting people that already, as Jess said, already experience insecurity. The sort of lower paid job market has been set up to keep people quite insecure, hasn't it, really? 0-hour contracts and the balance of power has shifted heavily towards the employer and away from the employee. And so you've got people relatively powerless, disempowered, lacking control and security, and encouraging people to talk about that, really. What does that feel like? And what are the harms of those feelings, really? What behaviours do those lead to that might be risky? And that might be an individual at risk from self-harm, self-neglect, or it might be individuals at risk from others who are exploiting them. So I think, what I would advise community groups to do is talk amongst themselves about what are these issues that might emerge amongst the group, the people they're supporting, what issues are already there and how they might be exacerbated, and try to create a culture of a safe space whereby people can talk to somebody about what's worrying them, and then try to be, hate to use the phrase stay alert, it's probably not a great phrase to use it, but organisations being alert to the safeguarding risks that the people they support may be experiencing and how those may be changing. Loneliness and isolation is a very dangerous factor in safeguarding, really. The more people speak to others and the more connections they have, the more people can look out for each other and care for each other and notice change. Once you have people isolated, and as a provider of drug and alcohol treatment services, we've noticed that we have found it hard to maintain certainly face-to-face connection with some of our clients, and so we're trying to do that by telephone. But people will tell you they're fine on the telephone. And so, you have to be quite acute and aware and listen to where someone is saying something, but you get the feeling they're not quite meaning it. And if that's the case, what can you do as a secondary action? So somebody says they're fine, you worry whether they really are fine. Actually, well, can you go around? Can you knock on the door? Is there another way of engaging them? Can somebody else go around, have a chat with them? So it's being quite alert, and it's probably not taking everything people are saying at face value, in a nice way, because people will like to tell you they're okay, but okay means different things to different people, doesn't it? Then what's the action plan we can put in place? Who can we refer people to? Drawing up a list, really, I think it's useful if you're an organisation. Have you got access to a list of potential referrals that you might make that you think will be useful for individuals, and And it might be that it's something the group does itself. Come along to our Wednesday group if you're okay, you can't come to Wednesday, maybe I could pop round on Thursday. And it's kind of having some options available to engage people, and then thinking of what are those good sort of community or national resources that would be helpful for people. So never underestimate the sort of power of the Samaritans, really. Of referring someone to their local GP. Not a lot of people want to go to their GP at the moment. Local support groups. So it's drawing up an appropriate list of resources for the community in which you work, being aware of who else is around and who's doing good work, who's doing support. And that might be knowing the local bereavement charity if there's somebody you're supporting who's recently been bereaved, knowing the local safeguarding police officer and local safeguarding board if you think somebody's at risk of domestic violence. Those are all good standard resources, but I would encourage people, if they're working in a particular region, to draw up their own local set of community assets, really. What are those community resources that individuals can draw on?
So Jess, I'm interested in knowing what your thoughts were around the ways that organisations can support these people, especially in terms of the material challenges that they might be experiencing.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it was a beautiful segue actually from what you were saying, James. So Living Wage Foundation is part of a larger charity called Citizens UK, which is a community organising charity that basically started off the Living Wage campaign 20 years ago. And Citizens UK have been organising throughout the current crisis and obviously before, but have had to change the way they organise quite rapidly with the kind of move to everything online. But it does mean that because we had to move all of the kind of all of that community organising effort online, it now means that we've got a kind of civil society page that has a lot of really useful resources. So one of the things that Citizens UK have been doing is running webinars every week, focusing on a different aspect of community organising, and that has ranged from working with community leaders to work out how they can help best support their communities in terms of their mental health. So that we had a webinar on that's I would recommend definitely checking out because it is really, really interesting. And it's signposted some resources, but also has some really interesting speakers. And basically is like a sort of précis on how to become a mental health champion within your community. There's also ran some webinars on how to organise for social justice for communities that have been most affected by COVID-19. And one of the things that sort of sparked is the Living Wage for Key Workers campaign. So the real focus recently has been on care workers specifically, because they're kind of one of the most badly affected industries in pretty much every single way possible. They're already facing low pay, insecure hours, and a kind of almost like a lack of respect basically for the vocation. But obviously now there's also been kind of a lack of PPE. Care homes have kind of witnessed the biggest loss of life in especially kind of early on in the crisis. So there's a kind of a real need to support care workers. So one of the kind of really specific actions that people can take if they wanted to support the campaign is if you go to the Citizens UK website, there's a tool where you can write to your MP and ask them to support the campaign, and basically ask the government to fund social care properly. Because one of the issues that social care has, as well as obviously being low paid, is that that low pay is caused by there not being enough money in the social care budget to put into local authorities pots of money to pay care workers a living wage. And obviously then that has kind of repercussions further down the line. People leave the industry because it's not enough to make ends meet. So that creates obviously way more vacancies in the industry. I think one of the things that we've heard from care employers is that even though there are loads of people now looking for jobs, the uptake of care vacancies has not gone up. So there's obviously like not only has it been exacerbated by the crisis, but it's actually that people just don't see it as like a viable option for work. And obviously mainly because it's low pay, insecure hours, and now you're also literally risking your life going into care work. And then finally making sure that you're supporting employers that were already doing the right thing before the crisis hit, have continued to do the right thing, even though quite a lot of them are operating in really low paying industries that have been hit really badly by coronavirus. And you can do that by checking out the Living Wage Foundation website, or checking out some of the other kind of partners that we work with, like Goble.
I want to come back to you, James, because you mentioned this idea of sustainable recovery, which I think is really important. I think the question I'd like to ask is, how can we practically organise to achieve the change that we need around financial well-being right now?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? I mean, I think a lot of the things that Jess mentioned, are really, really important. I think if people really want to understand the issues that those care organisations are facing in their community, and people providing care and support in communities, and how we can make that more sustainable. I think if you're not directly involved in care support, then sort of read around it, educate yourself. I think if you can volunteer for local community groups, I think my parents sort of probably didn't show a huge amount of interest in care and support in the community until about sort of 6-7 years ago, really, where they started volunteering for a local food bank, and understand in much better than I do about how food banks work and how you can access food banks and how people need, those fundamental basics of health and support, housing, food, employment opportunities, jobs that pay. And I would think probably have a slightly different outlook and perspective on life based on that experience, really. So I would always advise people to see if they can find experiences that bring them closer to the issues in the community. That's not appropriate for everybody, but if people can find something they can do to volunteer in their local communities, they will understand the issues. In terms of the answers, Jess talked there about a whole range of activities that people can get involved in. Fundamentally, society needs to have a greater care for the people that care for them. So we need to, clapping on the doorstep is fantastic, but when it stops, what's next? So where is the funding? Where is the commissioning of services that allow people to pay living wages to make care sustainable? And I think Jess made a fantastic point there, but I think people are now much more aware of the challenges and risks of caring professions. But where is the reward that goes with that? So there has been some government funding that has been distributed down to local authorities to be passed on to care homes, tranches of fairly significant amounts of money. But how is that sustainable? How is that going to play out over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? It's become the social norm that health and social care will always have waiting lists, will always be poorly paid, will always be heavily stressed. And it takes fundamentally, I think, kind of structural and political change, really. So, as Jess says, be aware of the issues, educate yourself. And when you can write to your MP, you're writing with real sort of first-hand knowledge. If you can say, I've seen this happen in this community, and there's an organisation that's doing terrific work. The local food bank is doing this amazing work. But should it be there in the long term? Is it sustainable? Let's push those MPs to really understand what's happening, really based on first-hand experience and based on the stories of what's occurring in the community. So I think it's also really important to find space for and arts projects do this sort of fantastically well, really, for people to be able to talk about their own lived experience of being cared for or caring for others in their own words and finding a space for those words to kind of come through and be viewed by others who are less familiar with the issue. So not everybody can go and volunteer, but everybody can find a space where they can kind of listen. Everybody can find a local arts project, or we need the sort of storytellers to have the space to share the stories, first-hand lived experience, so that people less familiar with the issues can understand, can empathise, and I would say can vote in a way that will make significant change, on a local and national level, really. So sort of vote for carers, vote for, clapping's brilliant. We need funding on a short-term basis, great, but we need funding on a long-term basis. We need a change in the level of esteem that we put in the people that care for us. And we need a different approach politically that values those people more than they are at the moment.
Thank you so much. I really agree, especially about the having those art spaces. I think there's a big power in kind of sharing narrative. Jess, I'm gonna move back to you now. Could you give us an example or examples of how change has been achieved in the past by applying these principles that we've discussed already?
Sure. So I guess the Living Wage campaign itself is a great example of how stories at the beginning about a specific problem that was facing a local community in East London in 2000, well, before that, but definitely, but the campaign itself started in 2001, and how it's now blossomed into this movement of over 6,500 businesses, as well as those communities that were there at the beginning, working together basically to kind of overhaul the way that we think about work. So like I said, the Living Wage campaign started in 2001 in East London. It began because a group of parents who were part of Citizens UK institution were basically discussing like how they were having to work 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs. They weren't being able to make ends meet. They weren't seeing their kids, like you said, James, before. They weren't able to take part in that kind of community life that is so important for people, for people's well-being and mental health, as well as kind of all the other things that you get from your local community. That we've definitely seen over the last few months that kind of importance of community has never been more important. But that's also where the Living Wage campaign came from. So those parents basically came together, were speaking to organisers from Citizens UK, from also Unison, the union were involved at the beginning as well. And they basically wanted to work out what they need. One of the solutions, obviously, to low pay is working out what people would need from one singular job in order, in terms of pay, in order to make ends meet. Which would then also allow them to take part in that kind of community life that was missing before when they were working those 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs. There's loads of stories that have come out of that. So one of the things that kind of kick-started that particular campaign was a cleaner from HSBC standing up at the AGM and talking about how he shared an office technically with the chairman, but they lived completely different lives. So he was finishing one job, going straight to a different one, and one of his jobs was cleaning like the office of the chairman. And that sort of kick-started the relationship with HSBC, who are now an accredited living wage employer. But that was a real clear, concrete example of how someone standing up, being courageous enough to share their story, actually made a material impact, not just on their own life, but also on the lives of literally now hundreds of thousands of others. One of the other institutions from Assistance UK chapter in Newham is St Anthony's School, and the kids at that school, one of the issues that they were facing was that they were also not seeing their parents because they were working in low paid jobs. So they were basically thinking about what they could do to help alleviate that situation, not only for their parents, but also their community. And they basically were looking around, looking at who the biggest employer in Newham was. And one of the biggest employers in Newham is City Airport. And they wrote a song about how life on low pay was affecting them and their families and their communities, and wrote to City Airport asking if they could come and perform the song for them. And from that original email to City Airport, now City Airport are accredited. They uplifted loads of staff to the living wage, especially all their third-party staff. And now the young people at St Anthony's, like a couple of years down the line, have been like celebrated in front of the Mayor of London at some of our events in Living Wage Week. They're also really like now become campaigners for the living wage in terms of also like setting up, this sounds like I'm a bit of a nan, but setting up a TikTok campaign with like, they've created a dance, so you can like, there's a dance that's supporting the living wage for key workers. So they've become from seeing the problem that was affecting their parents, their community, and their peers at school, all the way from that original kind of that point of going like, what can we do, seeing the living wage as a solution to that, and now becoming like really creative champions. It's just fantastic to see that kind of leadership from young people, that has been just so like inspiring, I think, to see that from young people. And I think like a lot of us were just like, what can we do? And it's like, look to the young people, look, especially because they're like the most creative out of everyone.
No, just to pick up, because you've focused on young people, I was quite interested in hearing from both you and James actually about our surveys, the starting age was 35, but how is this affecting young people right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the main issue with or the kind of one of the main issues facing young people is that even the minimum wage is lower for young people to begin with. So for people over 25, they get the minimum wage is the national living wage, which is the government's minimum for over 25s. But then there's like a sliding scale. So the younger you are, basically, the less the minimum wage you can get paid is. And obviously in some industries, that is basically what you will get paid. But we're also finding that it's then you're also like the I'm saying this in terms of what employers might think, but younger people might be like seen as less skilled because they haven't been in the job as long as some of the older people. So they might not be seen as productive as older people. So then we're more likely to be pushed out in terms of if an employer is having to make redundancies, they're more likely to get rid of younger staff first, even though they're cheaper, but they might not be as productive. And now they're more likely to be kind of pushed out of the roles that they were in to begin with. And then there's obviously like the cohort coming up from schools and from universities now, finishing school or uni, and then finding that there's no jobs to go into. So there is like a real crisis in terms of what young people can do in terms of getting jobs, let alone ones that are paid at a living wage, for sure.
James, how might this struggle be affecting the well-being of young people?
I think it's probably harder for young people nowadays than it's ever been, really. And I can't sort of throw that back to going back hundreds of years, but I think within recent memory and recent history, perhaps the last sort of 20, 30 years, when you look at how people can see their way to fulfilling their potential, it's really difficult, to be able to never mind buy a property, but sort of rent a place that is your own, where you can create your own sort of space, really, to as Jess talked about, to find work and find work that's going to be sustainable, where you're not seen as kind of short-term employment. And there are a lot of young people with quite complicated lives, really. Everything we talked about in terms of anxiety, lack of security, mental health, accessing resources, substance use problems affect people of all ages, really. It's vulnerability doesn't sort of discriminate in that respect, but those younger people who find it hard to access the resources to support themselves will be more harmed by those vulnerabilities. So I think it's probably harder than it's ever been, really, and we talked about the kind of creativity that and the potential and the need to hear those voices, really, and those experiences, and those need to come from people with that lived experience, not via the likes of sort of me, not curated and edited by a director at a charity, but via young people themselves, in appropriate spaces where we can kind of listen, just listen and understand those issues. But there are lots of young people with really complicated lives, really, and people that are caring for other family members, caring for parents, or even not necessarily those kind of vulnerabilities, but just trying to sort of make a way in life, really, and make decisions in a very uncertain world. It's really difficult. I think that Jess made a really fantastic point about what came across to me was those employers that have taken up the living wage, starting to actually learn about their employees' lives outside work, really. So the workplace as a community. So I think starting to think about where do we find ourselves, where we can actually create a sense of community, and workplace is a really, really important one. So those employers who perhaps have the more likely to be older, sort of senior managers, finding out about the lives of people that work for them. Talked about the person cleaning the chairman's sort of office, really. Share a space, but actually live in totally different worlds. So how can we bridge that gap? And one of the ways of doing that is to start to think about, can this workplace be a community? And if it's a community, where are the points of communication that aren't just hierarchical, following orders, but where can we kind of meet and discuss and exchange views in a non-hierarchical sense, which to me makes up community.
Okay, so I just want to say a massive thank you to both Jess and James for their input and valuable discussion today.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What stands out to me is the importance of psychological support for people from all levels of financial stabilities at a time of so much change and uncertainty. The support that individuals from different financial stabilities may look different. However, as reinforced in this discussion, it is key that we remember the importance of access to essential resources. It is empowering to learn that many of these needs can be met through the support of community groups, and through this we can nurture and grow a sense of togetherness. If you have any thoughts or questions, please do leave them in the comments. Thank you for joining our discussion here at The Coping Mechanism, and we look forward to welcoming you next time.